Before the judge even had time to bring the gavel down, Richard Hale, the man I had called my father for 28 years, sprang to his feet in the middle of the packed courtroom and delivered a single sentence that froze my entire life in place. He said, "The boy is not my biological son, and as of today, I am cutting him off from all inheritance." No one knew that inside the leather briefcase resting at my feet, there was a white envelope that had been waiting for this exact moment for more than 10 years. And when the truth was finally spoken, it would not be only me on trial, the entire Hale family would collapse. Richard Hale's words swept through the courtroom like a blade of ice. They did not only strike Evan, they cut straight through the crowd packed onto the wooden benches, through the flashing cameras, through the eyes that had already been waiting for a fall to witness. In that instant, the air inside the Suffolk County Courthouse felt drained away. People held their breath, as if even breathing too loudly might shatter the silence stretched to a breaking point. Evan did not move. Not a blink. Not a swallow. On his face was not the humiliation of being exposed, but the stillness of someone who had heard these words long ago. Only today they were spoken in front of hundreds of witnesses. In the front row, Claire Whitmore sat upright like a carefully sculpted statue. Her hand rested on Lucas's shoulder, the restless child scanning the room like a fledgling trapped inside a glass cage. Claire smiled, yet the corner of her mouth twitched ever so slightly, as if the smile were forced by habit rather than born of peace. Beside her, Richard's lawyer lowered his head, the pen in his hand stopping mid-stroke, like someone who had just heard a line that was never in the script. Richard stood in the aisle, shoulders squared, chin lifted. He delivered the denial the way one would read out a termination notice. To Richard, blood was a clause, inheritance was a contract, and Evan, for all those years, had been nothing more than a small line at the bottom of the page, something that could be erased at any time. At the farthest bench, where the light barely reached, Evan slowly placed his hand on the briefcase at his feet. An ordinary gesture, too ordinary. That very normality sent a chill through a few people in the room. He was not the kind of man who would fight back with tears, nor the kind who would shout. He looked like someone waiting for the exact cue to step onto the stage. Judge Donovan looked down at Evan, his eyes a mix of fatigue and caution. In inheritance disputes, he had seen everything: siblings tearing each other apart over money, children dragging the past out as a weapon, families turning into enemies overnight. Rarely, though, had he seen someone declared not family stand so still, like a rock in the middle of a storm. Claire glanced at Richard, a flash of urgency crossing her eyes before vanishing. She believed it would all end here, one denial, one strike of the gavel, one name crossed out of the will. By the book, clean, no fingerprints left behind. Evan stood up. The wooden bench let out a dry sound, small but sharp, because the room was so silent that people could hear the rustle of paper, the suppressed breaths, the cameras leaning forward like hunting animals. He stepped into the aisle, unhurried, every step steady, as if the floor belonged to him. The crowd watched, some waiting for humiliation, some for collapse, some for a quiet deal to be sealed. Evan simply bent down and opened the briefcase. Inside lay a white envelope, neat and restrained, like a secret kept for far too long. No sender's name, no decorative seal, just a clean white surface, like truth before it is stained. Richard saw the envelope, and for a brief moment, his eyes softened. A thin crack appeared on the face that had been forged into stone. He realized that what Evan held was not a plea, it was a counterstrike. Claire saw it too, her throat tightening, her hand on Lucas's shoulder gripping harder, not out of affection, but control. Suddenly, the chair beneath her felt unsteady. Judge Donovan leaned forward and asked, his voice low and measured, "Do you have a response, Evan Hale?" Evan held the envelope against his chest, as if placing his hand on an oath. There was no plea for recognition in his eyes, only something sharp and clear, like a blade freshly wiped clean. "I am not his biological son," Evan said, his voice calm, but each word fell to the floor like a heavy stone. "But today, this court will learn who truly does not belong to this family." Then he extended the envelope, as if handing the entire room a new name for the truth. In that moment, they finally understood what they had always underestimated. Evan was not here to beg for a share of the inheritance. He was here to reclaim the power that had been taken from him long ago, the power of the one who holds the evidence, the one who keeps the key, the one who can open a door no one wants to look behind. Somewhere in the room, someone swallowed hard. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second. Richard stood frozen, like a king hearing the knock of Judgment Day. And Evan, under the gaze of hundreds, remained calm, like someone who had walked through the dark long enough to know that dawn would come, even if it burned everything in its path. In the moment Evan stood in the middle of the courtroom, memory did not explode like a storm. It seeped in slowly, heavily, like water sinking into the marble floors of a house that was too large and too cold. If anyone had asked Evan when he had ever truly belonged to the Hale family, he would not have been able to name an exact moment. From the very first day he stepped into that mansion, he understood one thing clearly: there are places called home that never open their doors to the heart. The Hale estate sat high on a hill overlooking Boston Harbor. Every morning, sunlight poured through the wide glass windows, reflecting off polished stone floors so smooth they could mirror a face. Yet Evan never once felt warmth there. Only controlled silence, measured footsteps, and dinners that unfolded on time, in the correct seats, with the correct roles. Richard Hale always sat at the head of the table, back straight, eyes sharp, like he was presiding over a board meeting, even when the person across from him was just a child learning how to hold a knife and fork. Evan sat opposite him, quiet, learning to eat slowly, to speak little, and never to ask questions that might make others uncomfortable. He understood early that in this house, silence was a survival skill. The only person who ever broke that code was Margaret Hale. She did not move like the owner of the house, she moved like a breeze. The faint scent of chamomile tea followed her whenever she brushed past Evan, her hands always warm, her eyes always meeting his, never sliding past him as if he were a piece of furniture. Margaret was the only one who spoke Evan's name without a silent question hanging behind it. On evenings when Richard was absent due to long meetings, Margaret read to Evan in the small West Wing study. Her voice was low and unhurried, her pauses deliberate, as if every word carried weight. She never told Evan the world was fair. She told him that a person's worth is not decided by the one who stands highest in the room. Evan grew up between those two extremes. On one side was Margaret's quiet, steady affirmation. On the other was Richard's measuring gaze, always distant, always reserved. Evan excelled in school not because he was encouraged, but because he understood that mistakes were a luxury. He won awards not to be praised, but to avoid negative attention. At family gatherings, when Richard placed a hand on Evan's shoulder in front of guests, his smile was polite, his eyes never truly landing. The introductions were always the same: "This is Evan." No son. No heir. Just a name suspended in the air, as if it could be replaced at any time. Evan felt it most clearly during internal meetings at the Hale Corporation. As a teenager, he was invited to observe, supposedly to learn. But whenever he spoke, the room fell silent in a different way. Not listening, just waiting for him to finish so the important work could resume. Richard never said Evan did not belong. He did not need to. The way he stood a step away from him. The way he signed documents without looking back. The way he let others decide what Evan was allowed to know, and what he was not. All of it was answer enough. Then one afternoon, when Evan was 13, Margaret led him into the garden behind the house. The wind moved gently through the maple trees. She sat beside him, unhurried, unguarded, and spoke the truth with the respect one gives a child who deserves honesty. Evan was not Richard's biological son. The words did not break him. They simply gave a name to the feeling he had carried for as long as he could remember. Then Margaret placed her hand over Evan's chest and said something he would never forget: "You do not need the same blood to belong to my heart." Evan looked at her and for the first time saw tears in the eyes of the strongest woman he had ever known. In that moment, he understood something greater than bloodlines. In that house, there was one person who chose him. Just one. And it was enough to carry him through the years that followed. Richard never knew about that conversation, or if he did, he never mentioned it. He continued to live as though everything remained within the order he had designed. But Evan was different. From that day on, he began to observe more, remember more, and wait. Because when a child knows he is underestimated, he learns to accumulate what others cannot see. Not rebellion, but strength, silence, patience. And Evan had been patient for a very long time. Margaret Hale was not the kind of person who left emptiness behind when she was gone. Yet as she began to weaken, the house on the hill suddenly felt frighteningly vast. The hallways seemed longer, the ceilings higher, and the silence, once familiar, took on a new meaning. It was no longer discipline. It was waiting. Illness came to Margaret quietly, without drama, without warning. Just lingering fatigue, afternoons where she had to rest longer by the window, books closing earlier than usual. Evan was the first to notice, not because he was more perceptive than others, but because he watched her as if every change mattered. Richard was told later. He reacted as he always did. He called the best doctors, arranged treatment schedules, signed the necessary paperwork. Everything followed procedure. Yet, in the way he stood at the foot of the hospital bed, hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on his phone, Evan saw a different truth. Richard was managing a problem, not facing a loss. In the months that followed, Evan nearly lived in Margaret's room. He read to her, the way she had once read to him. His voice was not yet deep, but it was steady. Sometimes she closed her eyes and smiled, as if listening to herself from years ago. Other times she asked him to stop, just so she could hold his hand a little longer. One rainy afternoon, when the wind rattling against the window sounded like strained breathing, Margaret called Evan closer. She spoke softly, but without hesitation. She spoke of the things she had kept inside for too long, of a marriage that had slowly turned into a contract, of agreements never spoken aloud, and of Evan. She said that from the very first day she brought him home, she knew she was pushing against an invisible order. Richard did not object, but he did not accept it either. He allowed everything to exist in a gray space, where responsibility was fulfilled but affection was left empty. Margaret admitted she had always known Evan did not carry Hale blood, but she said it had never been a secret to her. The only secret was how long she had chosen silence, hoping that love might change a man who believed only in power. Evan listened without interrupting. He did not ask why. He did not accuse. In the dim yellow light, she looked much smaller than he remembered, and for the first time he saw a fear in her that was deeply human. The fear of leaving without fixing what could not be fixed, the fear of leaving him alone among people who had never truly seen him. 3 days before Margaret passed away, Evan held her hand in a hospital room heavy with the scent of antiseptic. She struggled to breathe, each breath like a long journey. Richard was not there. His assistant sent a short message saying he was abroad and would call later. Margaret smiled when Evan told her. Not bitterly, not resentfully. She simply squeezed his hand tighter and whispered, barely audible, that he did not need to prove himself worthy of any name, that his light did not come from bloodlines, but from the way he chose to become who he was. When the machines fell silent, the room entered a different kind of quiet. Evan stood there for a long time, not crying, not moving, as if leaving would erase the last thing holding her there. The funeral followed protocol. White flowers. Brief speeches. Richard stood in the front row, his face solemn, receiving condolences as if reviewing reports. Evan stood behind, silent, feeling as though a part of the house had been taken from him forever. Only after everyone had gone did he understand that what Margaret left behind was not a void. It was a responsibility, a truth yet to be spoken, and a silent promise that no matter what the world chose to call him, she had called him her son. 6 months after Margaret Hale's funeral, the mansion on the hill changed its scent before it changed its shape. The smell of chamomile tea vanished, replaced by expensive wood and cold perfume, a fragrance meant not for memory but for impression. Evan noticed it the moment he stepped into the main hall one early morning, when sunlight spilled across the stone floor yet stirred no familiar feeling. The house had begun to forget the woman who once held it together with warmth. Claire Whitmore entered Richard Hale's life as if she had been standing outside the gate for a long time, waiting. No noise, no permission. She appeared at a corporate charity gala, standing beside Richard with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what she brought to the table. When introduced, she looked Evan up and down, her gaze lingering just long enough to assess, then smiled like someone who had spotted an unnecessary detail in a flawless painting. The first time Claire set foot in the mansion, she said very little. She simply walked slowly through the space, fingers brushing the banister, eyes memorizing every corner, every object. Evan stood at the far end of the hallway, watching in silence. The way she looked at the house was not the way someone looks at a place they are moving into. It was the way someone prepares to restructure. The changes came quickly. Margaret's reading room was locked, supposedly for reorganization. Family photographs disappeared from the walls, replaced by abstract art devoid of feeling. The armchair where Margaret used to sit was moved away without anyone asking Evan a single question. Richard did not object. He did not explain. He let Claire do her work, as if it were a natural part of moving forward. A few weeks later, Claire announced she was pregnant. She said it at the dining table, her voice gentle, her eyes fixed on Richard. He froze for a rare moment, then smiled, a real smile Evan had not seen in years. Richard stood, placed his hand on Claire's stomach as if touching a new future. He said this was a second chance, a chance to have a real family. Evan sat there, hands on his thighs, back straight. He did not lower his head. He did not leave. But something inside him closed quietly. He understood. He was no longer a backup plan. He had never been the first choice. Now, he was not a choice at all. When Lucas was born, the house welcomed the child like a savior. A baby's cries filled rooms that had once been silent. Richard held his son, his eyes softening in a way Evan had never seen. Everything revolved around Lucas: time, schedules, dinner conversations. Evan stood at the edge, like a guest who had stayed too long. There was one small detail Evan did not miss. Lucas's hair did not resemble Richard's. It was darker, thicker. No one mentioned it. Evan remained silent. He had learned that in this family, questions that were not welcomed only made the person asking them expendable. One evening, Evan saw Claire wearing Margaret's old ring, the one with the green stone Margaret had promised to give him. When Evan asked, Claire smiled and said she had found it in an old box. Her voice was light, as if speaking of a nameless object. But Evan knew. She had not just taken a ring. She was taking a place. That night, Evan stood alone in the grand hall. On the wall hung a newly framed photograph. Richard, Claire, and Lucas. The Hale family. There was no place for him in the frame. Evan stared at it for a long time, then turned away. What he felt was not heartbreak. It was a small, smoldering fire, beginning to burn deep in his chest. And he understood then that some families do not collapse with noise. They collapse through replacement. The first signs did not arrive like an accusation. They came like small scratches on a surface that seemed perfect, easy to overlook, easy to explain away. But to Evan, who had spent his entire life reading the spaces between actions, they stood out like ink stains on white paper. Andrew Cole began appearing more frequently after Lucas was born. He was not family, nor a close friend, just a longtime financial advisor to the Hale Corporation, a man Margaret had once trusted for his restraint and discretion. Andrew was always neatly dressed, spoke only as much as necessary, his gaze never lingering too long on anyone. But since Claire entered the house, that gaze began to wander. Evan noticed it during late dinners. Andrew sat angled toward Claire, shoulders brushing as if by accident. Claire tilted her head to listen, a small, private smile meant for him, not for Richard. The moments passed quickly, but Evan was used to remembering what others dismissed as unimportant. He also noticed changes in Andrew's schedule. Meetings arranged outside normal hours. Business trips that aligned strangely well with Claire's calendar. Richard did not notice, or chose not to. He trusted numbers, trusted reports, trusted the kind of power that had served him for decades. He did not trust intuition. Evan did. One night close to midnight, Evan went downstairs for water. The light in the study was still on, Voices drifted out, low but urgent. Claire was on the phone. She said Andrew's name softly, familiarly. She spoke about needing to be more careful, said that Richard did not notice, but Evan did. She did not finish the sentence. Evan did not need her to. From that night on, he began observing with intention. No confrontation, no questions, only recording. He reviewed the corporation's expense reports, access Richard had once granted him under the guise of learning. Payments labeled vaguely. Small, discreet luxury hotels outside normal business routes. Dinner receipts without listed attendees. Evan was not looking for evidence to accuse. He was looking to confirm what he already knew. And with each confirmation, the feeling inside him was not anger, but a quiet settling, as if each piece were sliding into its proper place. The point of no return came on a rainy afternoon. Evan entered Margaret's old study, one of the few rooms Claire had not fully altered. On a bookshelf, behind old files, he found a small external drive labeled in Margaret's handwriting. She had always archived everything, not out of suspicion, but out of care. On the drive were emails never sent, unfinished drafts mentioning Andrew and Claire. No conclusions, no accusations, only questions without answers. Evan sat on the floor with his back against the shelf, and for the first time felt that Margaret had not fully left. She had seen something, and she had chosen to wait. Evan understood that if Margaret were still alive, she might have continued to stay silent. He no longer could. Not out of hatred, but because he realized he was standing at the line between being erased from the story and writing it himself. One morning, Evan watched Richard holding Lucas, pride filling his eyes. In that moment, Evan did not see a father. He saw a man placing everything on an assumption that had never been tested. And he knew that when the truth emerged, it would not just destroy a relationship, it would shake the very foundation Richard believed he had built from steel. Evan returned to his room, closed the door, and opened his laptop. He created a new folder, gave it a short name. No emotion, no symbols, just one word to remind him of what he was doing. Truth. In that moment, Evan was no longer the child standing outside the family frame. He became the one holding the story. And when someone long underestimated begins gathering evidence, it is no longer observation. It is preparation. Evan did not rush. He understood that some truths, if dragged into the light too early, become twisted until they no longer resemble themselves. So he allowed everything to continue as usual. Family dinners went on. Meetings passed with their growth charts and projections. Claire's laughter rang out at the right moments. Lucas's cries followed their expected rhythm. On the surface, everything was fine. Only inside Evan, a decision had been set in place like the final stone of a wall. He began with the smallest things. A strand of hair caught in Andrew's brush in the guest bathroom. A cloth Lucas often chewed on while teething. Richard's silver comb, the one he had carried since his youth. Evan collected them with absolute care, leaving no trace, revealing no intent. Every move was calculated, not out of fear, but because he knew he had only one chance. The samples were sent under an assumed name to a small laboratory in another state, a place that asked no unnecessary questions. Evan chose it because Margaret had once mentioned it in an old conversation, when she spoke of independence and discretion. When the package left his hands, Evan stood by the window for a long time. He did not pray. He did not hope. He simply waited. The days that followed moved strangely slowly. Evan still went to the office, still sat at his desk, still answered emails with his usual precision. But every time he saw Richard holding Lucas, a question surfaced in his mind that no one else in the house dared to ask. And every time Claire looked at him, her gaze sliding over him like thin ice over deep water, Evan knew he was on the right path. The email arrived on a gray morning. No long subject line, just a brief notice with an attachment. Evan opened it, his heart not beating any faster. What he felt was a deep stillness, like the moment just before a storm breaks. The results were clear, cold, without emotion. Lucas had no biological relation to Richard. The match between Lucas and Andrew Cole was nearly absolute. Every number, Every chart pointed in the same direction, allowing no other interpretation. Evan sat there for a long time. There was no cry of victory, no satisfaction of revenge. Only a heavy sadness, not for himself, but for a man who had built his entire life on a false belief. Richard had placed everything on bloodline, yet that bloodline had never existed. Evan printed the results in 2 copies. One he placed inside a white envelope. The other he locked away in a hidden drawer. On the envelope, he wrote a short line in steady handwriting. Margaret's truth. Not because she left it behind, but because she had spent her life protecting it. That night, Evan locked his bedroom door. A small act, but the first time he allowed himself the right to defend his own space. He lay on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were not of courtrooms or the collapse of the Hale family. They were of Margaret sitting in her study, warm light catching in her hair, her low voice reading words about how no one can outrun the past, only face it. Evan understood that from this moment on, he was no longer standing outside the story. He had become the one holding its key. And when a secret large enough is placed in the hands of someone long underestimated, the balance of power begins to shift, even if no one in that house has realized it yet. Power rarely reacts with panic. It reacts with refinement. When Evan slid the white envelope into his briefcase, invisible gears inside the Hale house began to turn faster, smoother, and more dangerously. No one shouted. No one confronted him. Only doors closing at the right moments, and conversations lowered into whispers. The first sign came through Evan's schedule. Meetings were postponed without explanation. Emails were answered more slowly than usual. People who once nodded to him in the hallway now avoided his eyes. No one said anything directly, yet the entire building began to treat Evan like a problem to be managed, not a member to be heard. Then one evening, as Evan was reviewing old files, a notification appeared on his screen. An internal audio recording, mistakenly routed to a folder he could access. Claire's voice came first, calm to the point of coldness. She said it was necessary to make sure Evan would not be allowed to speak at the upcoming hearing. That it would be enough to make him appear unstable. That the court does not listen to people whose motives are in question. Richard's voice followed, low and firm. He agreed. He said everything had to look reasonable. That the family could not be smeared by baseless speculation. Evan stopped listening at that point, not because it hurt, but because he understood he was no longer facing indifference. He was facing a plan. Andrew did not stay on the sidelines. He appeared more frequently in the media, speaking about responsibility, stability, and protecting the company's image during sensitive times. His words sounded like general advice, but Evan knew they were being placed carefully, at the right moments, to build a wall of public opinion before the truth could touch the ground. A new thread emerged when Evan received a late-night call from the family's former housekeeper, a woman who had worked under Margaret. Her voice trembled as she said someone had come to see her, reminded her of an old non-disclosure agreement, hinted at consequences if she misremembered certain details from the past. She did not say a name. She did not have to. Evan knew. He reassured her, told her she did not need to do anything. But after the call ended, he stood in the dark for a long time. Margaret had believed silence could protect people. Evan was learning that silence could also be used as a weapon to suffocate the truth. The next day, a petition was filed with the court, requesting limits on Evan's ability to speak due to conflicts of interest and alleged emotional instability caused by family loss. The language was smooth, legal, without a single crack. Evan read every line, feeling Claire's hand in the phrasing, Richard's hand in the final signature. He did not react immediately. He did not call a lawyer. He did not confront anyone. Instead, he opened the folder labeled Truth and added a new subfolder. Pressure. Inside it, he saved the audio recording, the emails, and precise timestamps. Evan was not collecting evidence to defend himself. He was collecting it to overturn the board. Another evening, Evan encountered Claire in the kitchen. She smiled and asked if he had been sleeping well. Her eyes studied him as if searching for a fracture. Evan replied politely, his voice even. In that moment, both of them understood the game had begun, and it would not end with a family conversation. Evan returned to his room, locked the door, and placed the white envelope on the table. He did not open it. He did not need to. What lay inside carried enough weight to bring down every strategy built to bury him. And when the person once deemed the weakest begins forcing the powerful into defense, it is no longer resistance. It is the sign of an irreversible shift. The hearing began earlier than expected, as if someone wanted everything finished before any new variables could enter the room. The courtroom was packed. White lights washed over the wooden benches where familiar faces from the legal world, shareholders, and family members sat shoulder to shoulder, all carrying the same vague expectation of a clean, efficient ending. Richard arrived late, walking in with the practiced stride of a man who believed order would always make way for him. Claire followed closely behind, dressed in dark fabric, shoulders straight, her expression revealing not a single crack. Andrew sat several rows back, so composed he was nearly invisible. Evan sat at the very back of the room. He did not look at them. He looked at the briefcase at his feet, where the white envelope rested quietly, as if it had never carried a seismic force inside it. Judge Donovan struck the gavel, his voice low as he called the room to order. Richard's attorney rose first and presented the filed motion, a request to limit Evan's right to speak due to conflicts of interest and suspected personal motives. The language was sharp, concise, perfectly procedural. The room nodded along out of habit. Evan stood when his name was called. Unhurried. Unshaken. He requested permission to make a brief statement, just a few minutes. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the room. He said he agreed with part of the motion, that he was not Richard's biological son. The words landed like a small stone, sending a ripple of low murmurs through the benches. Claire tilted her head slightly, the corner of her mouth lifting into a faint smile. Richard stared straight ahead, unreadable. Then Evan continued, his pace quicker. He said that if today was about bloodlines, then the court deserved to hear the whole truth, unfiltered, unedited. He stepped forward, opened the briefcase, and removed the white envelope. The soft rustle of paper sounded unnaturally loud, so clear it seemed people could hear suppressed breathing. Judge Donovan hesitated for a beat, then nodded. Evan opened the envelope and pulled out the report. He did not read at length. He read only what mattered. Lucas had no biological relationship to Richard Hale. The match between Lucas and Andrew Cole was nearly absolute. The numbers were read slowly, clearly, leaving no room for misunderstanding. The courtroom fractured, not in an instant shout, but in a surge of whispers, shifting chairs, a sharp intake of breath from somewhere in the crowd. Claire jumped to her feet, her voice breaking as she denied it, called it fabrication. Andrew rose by instinct, then froze, like a man realizing every exit had been sealed. Richard turned toward them, and for the first time in many years, certainty drained from his eyes. Evan did not stop. He placed the report on the clerk's table and stepped back. He said he had not come to take a child away. He had come to stop a lie from continuing to decide the fate of others. He said that some families do not collapse from a lack of love, but from an excess of silence. Claire staggered, one hand gripping a chair. Andrew lowered his head, silent. Richard sat down slowly, as if the weight of the entire room had settled onto his shoulders. In that moment, power shifted. Not through a gavel, not through law, but through a truth that had waited for the right moment to speak for itself. Evan returned to his seat. The now empty envelope lay on the table. He did not look back. He knew that from this moment on, the story had turned onto a path no one in that room could control anymore. The truth did not end when the hearing adjourned. It simply changed form. Only hours later, footage of Evan reading the DNA report spread beyond the courtroom like a spark caught by wind. Phone screens lit up everywhere, in cafes, in elevators, on the desks of people who had never met Evan yet were already ready to judge him. The headlines were sharp and irresistible. Adopted son turns on powerful family. One envelope destroys an empire. The truth was compressed into a few cold lines, addictive enough to consume, insufficient to understand. Evan did not watch. He turned off his phone and left the building through a side exit. There was no applause, no reporters chasing him down, only cold wind striking his face and a hollow feeling spreading slowly through his chest. When the truth is spoken, it does not arrive with victory. It arrives with consequences. And the consequences came fast. The next morning, Evan's consulting contract was terminated. No lengthy explanation, just a brief, polite email stating that the firm wished to avoid public controversy. Partners who once praised his caution fell silent. Those who had called him a rising talent now called him a risk. Online, two sides formed almost instantly. Some called Evan brave. Others called him destructive. They argued about morality, family, and money, yet no one asked how Evan felt standing at the center of it all. Anonymous messages began to appear, vague threats, suggestions that he should disappear. Evan read them all and did not respond. He was used to being treated as expendable. Richard did not reach out. Claire vanished from public appearances. Andrew held a press conference, denying all accusations, speaking of manipulated evidence and technology capable of falsifying anything. He spoke with the calm of a man who believed that if a lie was repeated often enough, it would become another version of truth. The Hale family closed ranks. Distant relatives, names that surfaced only during holidays, began to speak out. They said Evan had always been different, always difficult to integrate, always carrying quiet resentment. They wrote long posts about protecting the family's honor, as if honor were a coat that could be worn by anyone standing on the correct side. Evan moved out of the mansion. A small apartment with thin walls and minimal furniture. For the first time in years, no one controlled his schedule, no one watched the way he stayed silent. Yet that freedom came with a deep, nameless exhaustion. One night, when the city was asleep, Evan played an old recording. Margaret's voice filled the room, low and steady, reading about how a person becomes truly strong only when there is nothing left to hide. Evan sat on the floor, back against a chair, letting her voice occupy the empty space. He understood then that speaking the truth does not guarantee anyone will stand with you. It only guarantees that you are no longer standing with a lie. And in a world where image matters more than essence, that is a price not everyone is willing to pay. Evan looked around the small apartment, no portraits, no symbols of a lineage once considered untouchable. He exhaled slowly. He was no longer the one erased from the family frame, but he did not yet know who he would become next. One thing was certain. When you break the silence, the world will try to silence you back. And standing your ground after that is the real test. Evan did not strike back immediately. He understood that after a major explosion, the most dangerous thing is not the echo, but the cloud of dust that follows. Inside that haze, truth can be twisted, crushed, and reshaped into a different story, one far more convenient for those in power. If he wanted real light to reach the surface, he had to choose another path. Not social media. Not arguments. But records. He began by reopening everything he had collected. Internal audio recordings. Chains of emails that had been deleted and recovered. Hotel invoices billed to the company with no legitimate business purpose. Location data from trips that aligned too perfectly between Claire and Andrew. Everything was reorganized, not by emotion, but by timeline. Evan did not write a single accusation. He let the facts line up on their own. The outlet he chose was a local newsroom, not glamorous, but known for patience and resolve. The investigative editor was a middle-aged man with a low voice and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many cover-ups. Evan did not ask for sympathy. He simply placed a hard drive on the desk and said he wanted the truth printed, without his name in bold. The investigation unfolded quietly. Verification calls. Data cross-checks. Long nights without spotlights. Meanwhile, Andrew continued appearing on camera, speaking about honor and being falsely accused. Claire stayed silent. Richard remained silent too, as if silence could reverse time. The article was published on a gray morning. No sensational language. No dramatic framing. Just a sequence of events placed side by side with brutal clarity. Financial evidence. Security camera images. audio clips with voices too familiar to deny. Each piece locked into place, forming a picture no one could refute. The reaction came like an undercurrent. Investors withdrew. The board demanded explanations. People who had once defended the Hale family began deleting posts, changing their tone, falling quiet. Andrew held another press conference, but this time his words were emptier, his eyes less steady. There were no easy questions anymore. No one believed the repeated denials. Evan watched from a distance. He did not appear on television. He did not give interviews. He sat in his small apartment, reading every analysis, every independent confirmation. What he felt was not satisfaction. It was like a long-standing pain finally being given its proper name. Not pleasant, but necessary. One evening his lawyer called. The calm voice explained that the countersuits had been dismissed for lack of merit. The authenticity of the data had been confirmed by independent experts. Evan ended the call and sat still for a long time. No celebration. No relief. Just another silence, deeper and more real. He looked out the window. The city kept moving, indifferent to the collapse of names once revered. Evan understood then that light never arrives to applause. It comes through the persistence of those willing to let truth slowly prove its own worth. And this time, he had not been pushed out of the story. He was the one who rewrote it, line by line, without asking permission. As the external shock slowly faded, Evan realized that the loudest noise had never been on the front pages. It was inside him. A hollow space opened once the truth had been fully spoken, with nothing left to chase and no one left to prove anything to. In those days, Evan stopped following the news. He began to sort through things, not the small apartment, but layers of memory that had been neglected for far too long. The box appeared on a light, rainy afternoon when Evan returned to the old mansion one last time to collect what remained. The house felt different, emptier, not because furniture had been removed, but because the people who once occupied its space had left in a way that could not be undone. In Margaret's reading room, beneath the staircase where light never reached, Evan found a small metal box covered in dust and hidden with care. He recognized it immediately. The hiding place carried Margaret's signature, careful, unassuming, and deliberate. Inside was an old notebook with a soft cover and yellowed pages. The familiar handwriting appeared, steady and calm. Evan sat on the floor with his back against the wall and opened the first page. Margaret wrote about the early days after she brought him home, about how she saw in him not a child to be saved, but a person to be chosen. She wrote about the exhaustion of trying to hold the family together with silence, and about her greatest fear, not losing her reputation, but letting Evan grow up in a house that never called him son. The final pages were written during the months of her illness. The handwriting shook more, but it was not weak. Margaret admitted she had known about Claire and Andrew, that she had seen what was happening behind her back. But she chose to wait, not out of cowardice, but because she wanted Evan to have more time to live without carrying that truth. She wrote that some truths, if they arrive too early, will crush what is still fragile. Evan closed the notebook, tears falling without sound. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry not from anger, not from loss, but from being understood. Margaret had seen him, deeply enough to know he did not need to be protected by lies, but needed to be loved with patience. He brought the notebook back to the small apartment, and placed it on the shelf beside a few books she once read to him. In her words, Evan found no call for revenge, no condemnation, only a quiet legacy. What Margaret left behind was not wealth or power, but a standard for living, that truth does not need to shout, and that love does not require blood to exist. In the weeks that followed, Evan began to shift direction. He used part of the legal settlement to establish a small fund in Margaret's name to support children without stable families in their education. There was no grand launch, just a quiet decision carried out the way Margaret had lived. When Evan signed the final documents, he felt one thing with absolute clarity. The battle was over, not because he had won, but because he was no longer defined by what had tried to erase him. Margaret's true legacy did not live in the notebook or the fund. It lived in the fact that Evan, for the first time in his life, knew where he belonged. Not to a family bearing the Hale name, but to a truth he could stand with openly, without hiding. Richard Hale sent the letter after weeks of silence. Not an email. Not a call through lawyers. A handwritten letter on thick paper, the writing rigid but no longer straight as it once was. Evan received it on a quiet morning, just as the city was waking and sunlight slanted through the window of his small apartment. There was no return address on the envelope, but Evan knew the sender the moment he touched it. Richard wrote that everything he had built had collapsed faster than he ever imagined. The board had forced him out. The people who once stood around him had vanished. He did not write to ask for forgiveness. He wrote that for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to defend except the truth. And if Evan agreed, he wished to meet, not as father and son, but as two men who had passed through the same mistake. Evan read the letter slowly. No anger. No irony. Only a deep fatigue that no longer felt heavy. He agreed to meet. They sat across from each other in a small cafe near the harbor, a place Margaret once liked to stop whenever the city became too loud. Richard looked older, not from age, but because the armor of power was gone. He placed a small wooden box on the table. Inside were old photographs, Evan and Margaret in moments that had never been displayed in the mansion. Richard said Margaret had hidden them, had fought to keep them, and that he had never understood why. They did not talk much. They did not revisit the trial. They did not mention Claire or Andrew. The silence this time was not control. It was an acknowledgement that some things cannot be repaired, only stopped. News about Lucas followed not long after. The court decided to place the boy with a distant relative of Margaret, an elderly woman living in the outskirts with a small garden and a quiet life. Evan visited once. Lucas played on the rug, laughing as a small dog ran in circles. The child was safe, and that was enough. Evan did not fight for custody. He understood that love does not always mean holding on. The months that followed passed slowly. The fund bearing Margaret's name began receiving its first applications. Children once overlooked now had another doorway into the future. Evan stood before a small group at the first gathering and said that family is not where you are born, but where you are chosen. He did not speak of the past. It was no longer necessary. One afternoon, Evan stood before an empty plot of land on the edge of the city. Margaret had once said she wanted to open a small library there, a place where children could read without being asked about their origins. Evan bought the land and placed a simple sign in the ground, Margaret's Library. Rain fell lightly, not cold. Evan stood still, feeling a rare sense of peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because he was no longer running. On the night the library opened, Evan read to the children the words Margaret once read to him. His voice was steady. The light was warm. On the wall hung only one photograph, Margaret smiling, as if she were watching him from somewhere very close. Evan was no longer the son who had been erased. He did not need to become a symbol of collapse either. He was simply someone who chose to speak the truth, live with it, and build something decent from what remained. If you have stayed with this story until now, leave a comment, not to judge who is right or wrong, but to share whether you have ever stood up for your own truth. And if this story made you believe that a person's worth does not come from bloodline or power, press like and subscribe, because there are still many forgotten stories waiting to be told, and the next one might be closer to you than you think.